In this video, we will talk about the context of the Pastoral Epistles. The Pastoral Epistles in the New Testament are quite a bit different from the other epistles we find. The texts we're talking about here are 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, which we'll look at individually in a moment. The focus of these epistles is on how to run a church. This focuses on church leadership and organization. We get the word pastor used in the title we give to these texts, as somebody who is running a church or ministering to people. These texts are often called Deutero-Pauline, meaning Second Pauline, and many scholars do not believe that Paul actually wrote the letters. We see a focus on institutionalized Christianity with this organization and leadership, which does not seem to begin until the late 1st century CE, which would be after the time of Paul's death. Additionally, these texts provide basic instructions on running a church and spreading Christianity to Timothy and Titus, who both traveled with Paul and would already have known most of this information. The vocabulary we see in the text is also quite different from what we see in Paul's other epistles. Whether Paul actually wrote these texts or not is still up for debate. We have evidence on both sides, and the vocabulary differences may simply be because Paul was writing to different audiences. Margaret Mitchell, in the New Oxford Annotated Bible, claims each reader should consider the evidence about the authorship of these pastorals cumulatively. First is a question of historical fact. Did Paul write them or not? Then, and separately, one should reflect on the interpretive and theological implications of such a decision, for the denial of Pauline authorship may or may not entail a loss of authoritative status for that document within a particular religious community. Whether or not the pastorals were written by Paul, we need to think about this and think about what context and what evidence there is for both sides to make the determination of whether Paul wrote them or not. Let's turn to 1 Timothy to begin with. I've already addressed the issue of Pauline authorship. Paul possibly wrote this letter, but again many scholars argue that he did not. If Paul did write it, it was probably around the late 50s to early 60s, after his time in Ephesus, but not long before his death. If it's inauthentic or not Pauline, it was probably written in the late 1st to early 2nd century, because this is when the church, organization, and institution became developed more. The audience, of course, is Timothy. We meet Timothy in Paul's other letters, as well as in Acts, and he's a half-Gentile man who travels with Paul. His circumcision is a major issue in Acts, and he becomes circumcised even though he's part Gentile, to be able to reach his Jewish audience better. The author's intention, if we are assuming it's Paul or at least written through Paul's voice, is to exhort Timothy to push back against the false teachings that are happening within the church. We've talked about Gnosticism before, as well as Judaism, and these things could possibly be at play here. In 1:4, we see an emphasis on endless myths and genealogies, which could either be a discussion of the Judaizers who thought that Christians had to adhere to Jewish law, or of Gnostics who thought that there was a way to trace back lineages and through mystical teachings. Whatever the context here, what we see is the author telling Timothy to push back against these so-called false teachings. The letter also offers encouragement to Timothy to keep going in his ministry, even in the face of persecution and being pushed back against. And finally, there's a discussion of church organization and how a church should be set up and run. And we see these instructions detailed in 1 Timothy. The letter to Titus is in some ways similar to 1 Timothy. We again do not know if Paul actually wrote this letter or not. If Paul did write it, it was probably in the early 60s, like 1 Timothy, perhaps sometime between 62 to 64. If inauthentic, again, this was probably written from the late 1st to early 2nd century, when the church organization and institution began developing. The audience we see here is Titus. Titus is not just half Gentile, like Timothy, but is fully Gentile, and is actually uncircumcised. He's mentioned in Galatians and 2 Corinthians, and supposedly helped founding and running the Corinthian church. The intent of this letter, again from Paul's perspective, whether he wrote it or not, was to commission Titus for Crete. We have no evidence that they were traveling to Crete, so this could be something added on later because of Crete's rebellious attitude. We also see a focus on resisting false teachers. In this case, we see the Judaizers as well as the rebellious, which seem to be symbolic of the Cretans. And again, like 1 Timothy, we see a focus on church organization, how to run a church. Again, scholars question whether Paul actually wrote this text. If Paul wrote it, it was probably sometime between 64 and 68 CE, when he was in Rome in prison. If not, again, this is probably late 1st to 2nd century. However, unlike 1 Timothy and Titus, which most scholars argue were not Pauline, 2 Timothy is more open for debate and quite a bit different. The tone we see in 2 Timothy is a bit more personal. If you think back to Philippians, Paul's tone there and his closeness to the Philippian church, we see something similar mirrored here. Again, the audience is Timothy, and in this case, the intent seems to be final instructions for Timothy's ministry. The letter is set up in some ways like Paul's final testament, to explain to Timothy the last things that he needs to do, and because Paul is facing his death quite soon, and probably during this period that he's in prison. The author also seems to want to recall Timothy to Rome. In this case, again, if Paul wrote it, it would be a focus on bringing Timothy back for companionship when Paul is facing these hard times leading up to his death. Again, whether Paul wrote this or not is up for debate, but this letter seems to have a bit more personal tone than the ones we see in 1 Timothy and Titus, indicating to many scholars that Paul did in fact write this. As we think back to Dr. Mitchell's words, we need to remember to consider these texts separately. Even though it's tempting to consider all of the pastoral epistles as a whole, and think about the authorship and dating of all of them, we must think about each one separately and each one's intentions, language, and focuses. As I mentioned, this text reads like a final testament of Paul, which might be an indication of Pauline authorship if Paul was in fact in prison writing this letter right before his death. Now that we've reached the end of this video, you should be able to explain the authorship, composition date, audience, and authorial intent of the pastoral epistles, describe the historical setting and context of the pastoral epistles, and identify the themes in the pastoral epistles, and give examples of how they are used in the text.